Hello, and welcome to 10 Kids, 2 Docs Parenting Insights from Pediatrician Moms. I'm Sylvia Bank.
And I'm Vivian Carlin. Welcome back.
Today, we are going to tackle a topic that isn't a medical emergency, but can be one of the most stressful periods of time for a family. And that topic is head lice.
Ooh, good one, Sylvia. This is almost a rite of passage for any parent to have head lice go through your family.
And the more children you have, the more likely you are to have a case of head lice in your family.
Oh, true. So, of course, you and I both have experience with head lice.
Welcome to the 10 Kids, 2 Docs podcast. Seasoned pediatricians and longtime friends, Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin have counseled thousands of parents and are raising 4 and 6 kids, respectively. Join these doctor moms as they incorporate fun and their combined wisdom and experience to share parenting insights for anyone looking for practical and trustworthy guidance. Please note that this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment from your doctor.
So, why don't we start by talking about our own personal experiences with head lice? Why don't you start?
Okay, let's see. This was my first encounter with head lice. My oldest was in sixth grade, and she had been telling me that her head was itchy, and I just assumed she had dry scalp. It was not even on my radar. I wasn't thinking about it. And then a couple weeks later, I was at the hospital and I was getting ready to start a resident conference. And just a couple of minutes before the conference started, I got a call on my phone and I recognized it was from my younger kids' schools. It was the principal calling to tell me that one of my daughters had been itching her head and her teacher had looked and had found head lice, like actual bugs crawling in her scalp. Oh, so disturbing. Okay, so if you can imagine, I had to finish that phone call and then compose myself to go literally give this lecture while trying not to be demoralized by the fact that I knew what was facing me when I got home that day, and that was going to be 6 children plus myself, probably all infested with head lice.
Our family had head lice for the first time. It was the summertime, and then my older daughter, similar to your oldest daughter, was complaining
Mhm.
of itchy scalp. And we had been to the beach, sometimes they get sand in their
Sure,
hair.
yeah, yeah.
I was completely like, "Oh, you're fine. Here, use this dandruff shampoo." And I think something like a month went by,
Mhm.
and I discovered not just a couple of louse. I think it was like hundreds
Oh,
in
oh,
her hair.
oh my
She was
God.
infested because it had been months. So that older daughter was our primary case, and a large delay before we realized. We actually cut hair. My daughters had longer hair at that time, and I'm like, "You know what? It's easier to come through when the hair is short." So I gave her a bob. I have to say, I was completely overwhelmed having to comb through all the kids.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
actually wound up, I've told you guys this before, I'm not a big crier, but I actually wound up crying because I was so overwhelmed with the head lice. And when my older son saw me crying, he was 9. He was like, "Okay, mom, I'll shave my head."
Oh.
So he went out there, his dad gave him the buzz cut that he gives himself, and I have to say, it's probably one of my most touching periods of parenting where I know my older son did not want to have his head shaved, and he did that for me. I still feel very touched by that. Over 10 years later, it still touches me how he did that for me. Actually have I don't know if you have in your area
Oh,
lice nurses?
yes, 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 yeah.
Yes, where you can
For
pay
it?
them
Yes,
hundreds of dollars for them
yes.
to come through.
I called them and got a quote, actually.
How much was it?
Oh, for my family, I wanna say it was like $750.
Yes, hundreds of dollars.
Way too many people. I will say that when you talk about the hundreds of lice that you found, which just makes all of our skin crawl thinking about that. I remember my daughter, who was the one who initially was discovered at school, which is also very humbling, right? I would have much rather just found it myself than it had to be
Right.
the teacher that found it. At any rate, this daughter, she would refer to it as this nest that was at the back, the nape of her neck, which is a pretty common place. So as the days went on, she would be like, "Have you checked the nest? Are there any more left in the nest?" And that also makes my skin crawl because there was just a whole grouping all together.
Oh.
Gross.
So I think first of all, you highlighted having the teacher,
Mhm.
discover it in school. There's like this like social stigma associated with having head lice, and it's somewhat embarrassing
Mm,
to be diagnosed and so publicly diagnosed with head lice. I think for me, that period of time was that we had actually gotten together with some friends in the weeks prior, where I had to go back and contact those friends
mm,
to make sure they were getting checked out and looked at. As the years went on, I saw that pretty much everybody has head lice, there's
yes,
nothing to be ashamed
yes.
of. And I do have to, outline the extent of my paranoia, having been traumatized by this experience. I actually, for my youngest child, maybe 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, I put her in braids every day.
Oh, Sylvia, that is a big step,
It's
actually.
a huge commit that was something that I just didn't want to have again.
I remember after the first couple of rounds of combing my kids through and still finding lice or nits, I went into every bedroom. I gathered up every stuffed animal that we owned, and we own a lot,
Yes.
every pillow, and I designated one bedroom, and I just put everything in there and locked the door so no one could open it. And we just kept it all locked in there for a week. Then I
Mhm.
just knew that any remnants that might have been in the house all died off in the week that they were
Right,
sitting in that bedroom.
in your stuffed animal quarantine
Yes.
because they don't have a live host to live
Yes.
off of.
Yes, yes.
That's brilliant. I did a lot of knit combing. They make this very fine tooth comb where it almost looks like a half semicircle with the bristles coming off of the flat end. And the bristles are very tight together. There's no space, and there's like a spiral in each of the bristle.
Mm, yes.
Is this how you remember? So as you kind of comb through and catch a knit, within the teeth, you can kind of comb out of the hair and it gets trapped on the teeth of the comb. So there
Yes.
are the louse, which is a tiny little bug that crawls around in the hair, and they love warmer places on the scalp, which is oftentimes why they live in that base of the neck, your daughter's nest.
Yes.
Um, and they travel along the hair follicle, and the females will lay eggs, and they're securely attached to the hair.
Oh,
Um,
very securely.
so if you are trying to both get rid of the active bugs by trapping it in the comb and pulling it out, and then the hair itself, you have to kind of grab onto the hair between almost your fingernails
Yeah,
and rub it along the length of the hair until the end. It's almost like you're pulling each individual hair
it
to
is.
get this
Yeah.
tiny little egg, which almost looks like a teardrop, you know, off the edge of the hair.
So we decided to adjunct our treatment with olive oil. And Sylvia, I just want to interject as I tell this story. We're going to talk in a few minutes about topical ivermectin. That was FDA approved for head lice a little bit more than a decade ago. It took a few years for it to become more widely available. So when I'm telling my stories of my first encounter with head lice, this was before topical ivermectin was widely used and available. And that's really been a game changer in this. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But the methods that I'm going to describe I would still use in certain situations and are still very effective. And so I was putting olive oil in my kids' hair at night, and then I would comb through, and then I was using a baby wipe. So I would take a white baby wipe, comb through, and then wipe the comb out on the baby wipe. And that contrast of the white wipe, I could see if I was
Mm,
getting anything out as a measure
mm,
of like, is this working day after day? Like, am I still
mhm.
getting anything out on the knit comb?
Talk about your philosophy on the olive oil. How was that implemented and why did you decide to do that?
Okay, so the olive oil is just a one of the many asphyxiation home remedies out there where theoretically you are not allowing any air or oxygen to get to either the nits or the live lice, and eventually that kills them off. It also creates a lubricant that it makes it easier to comb out the
Mm,
nits,
mm.
as well as the lice. So olive oil is something everybody has in their house. It doesn't have to be extra virgin, like cheap olive oil.
And so you super saturate the scalp and the entire hair with
Yes.
olive oil.
Yes, and then you comb through, and I mean, the first day we used it, I had already done the over the counter, the permethrin. I had already combed through with the knit comb, and then the first day that I did the olive oil, the amount that I got out was shocking to me. Like, wow, I missed all of this using other
Mm.
methods, right?
So it is thought of, well, I went swimming all day at the pool, the lice are probably not alive. And I think the lice can actually hold their breath for some time. So is there like a length of time that
Yes.
you use olive oil to make sure that they asphyxiated?
Yeah, so I would olive oil and then I would comb to use it as the lubricant. And
Mhm.
then I would leave the olive oil in overnight, and then the next morning we would wash it out, and they would go to school. So I wasn't combing in the morning because I didn't have time. I had to do that at night. So
Oh, I see.
lubrication at night, but then there was still enough olive oil density in their hair, they could go to bed with the olive oil in their hair, and then they could rinse the next morning and go to school. Now, I will say my kids were like 6th grade and younger, and there are some downsides. You know when you go to, an Italian restaurant and with your bread, you get a bowl of olive oil
Yes,
with the pepper on top and whatnot.
yes.
My daughters will still say that they just really don't enjoy that because it just reminds them of sleeping with olive oil in their hair.
Oh, that's funny. So, we've talked a little bit about home remedies related to treatment of lice, but I want to highlight a little bit in the second half about medicines and how your pediatrician can get involved with helping you treat lice. So, now we're going to move on and talk about ways that you can treat head lice. The treatments that are available are over the counter, and I want to just highlight what they are and how you can use them. So, first of all, it's a product that you'll find called RID, or Nix, Nix.
And Rid and Nix both contain permethrin, which is a pediculicide, which is just a fancy term for an insecticide that is specific to lice. Very inexpensive. It's widely available. The downsides is that there is a 75% resistance rate to Rid or Nix. So, like you described, Sylvia, it's a great thing to use first, and you can debulk the number of lice. I know in my experience when I used it, you do just see lice falling out of the hair when you
Right,
shampoo. So you're like kind of debulking the amount of lice that are in the hair, but
right,
it's not a very effective treatment to eradicate the lice because
right.
there's such a high resistance rate.
And then, like we said before, if you feel like there's even a couple of lice left over in your treatment, then that could be enough to then repopulate and have a whole nother infestation.
Right, right. So then the next line, which is probably one of mine and yours favorite medications, is Sklice. So let's talk about Sklice and what that is.
So, Slice, Sklice, which is a great name because it like slices the lice, is a product that used to be a prescription and it's actually now available over the counter. And it is a topical cream that you apply to the scalp.
Right. So Sklice is a topical ivermectin. When I've used it, it reminds me of the consistency of white glue. It's not quite as sticky, but it's sort of that, I don't know, like a tacky consistency. And the idea is that you rub it down the whole length of the hair shaft. And then you leave it in for 10 to 15 minutes and then you rinse it out. You don't shampoo for at least 24 hours, but you rinse it out. And I love topical ivermectin because unlike permethrin, ivermectin is very good in eradicating lice. There is no resistance rate. Ivermectin even coats the eggs so that as the lice hatch, if they survived through that initial treatment, they die fairly quickly due to the ivermectin that's remaining coated on the egg. So you generally only have to use it once. I do always recommend checking, continuing to check your child's hair 7 to 10 days out to make sure you don't see any signs. And if there is a reoccurrence, then you can go ahead and use ivermectin a second time. But often that's not even needed. It's a one and done treatment. It's really changed how we can treat head lice. And It's been great now that it's become abundantly available. When I was talking about ivermectin 10 years ago, nobody had heard of it. Of course, now everybody knows what ivermectin is because of COVID-19.
When you've tried these over the counter remedies and you have recurrent lice, this is usually the time where you go to the pediatrician to seek perhaps a prescription.
Right. So that's true. It's actually now in the American Academy of Pediatrics guideline in refractory cases of head lice or situations where you just cannot treat it topically. There is an option to consider a prescription of oral ivermectin. Again, ivermectin topical lotion is very effective. So if applied correctly, that really should be effective in getting rid of the lice.
And sometimes people seek the pediatrician early on just to confirm the diagnosis. I've definitely have patients with itchy scalps. They're not sure if they're seeing nits. They're not sure if they're seeing lice. So they come into the pediatrician just to confirm, yes, this is lice. And then I sometimes show them, this is what the knit looks like. Let me see if I can find a louse and show you what that looks like, just to kind of educate the parents on what they're looking for when they are, trying to see if it's there or if it's gone.
I think that
Mhm.
people that haven't dealt with this before are surprised by how incredibly hard it is to see the eggs. In fact, some of the over the counter, the Nix and Rid, they often come with a louse comb and some come with a magnifying glass because that's literally what you need sometimes to be able to see what those eggs look like. And the lice themselves avoid the light. So often as you're parting the hair and looking, they're moving around so that you don't actually see them, which is why often it requires a certain density of lice in the hair for you to even catch it. So, really good point. If you're not trained and looking for it, you can absolutely miss it. There's no shame in that. And it can look very similar to dandruff, which is another difficult thing to distinguish that your pediatrician can help you with.
Right. So you can definitely make an appointment with your pediatrician just to confirm the diagnosis.
And as you talk about reasons to visit the pediatrician, under the age of 6 months, I would not recommend using any type of pediculicide. Of course, infants generally have finer hair. It's less common for them to get head lice, but they still can. They would be a good reason to see your pediatrician to confirm the diagnosis if you have any concern about your infant, because not only do we not want to expose them to an insecticide, but we also know that their skin in general is just so much more sensitive. Okay, so in summary, if we ever had head lice again, which I really hope doesn't happen at this point, I would use Glice or a topical ivermectin generic. I would treat everybody once and then I would watch and 7 to 10 days later recheck everyone thoroughly to decide if we needed to do it a second time. If I wasn't sure that we had head lice, but I had suspicion, I might use olive oil on one child first and then really comb out their hair. And if I got absolutely nothing, I would figure that we probably actually didn't have head lice. As you've pointed out, head lice can be very tricky to find. So olive oil would be a great way to try to confirm the diagnosis because again you're going to get that lubricant effect as well as you slow down the actual live lice when you have olive oil in the hair, and it's much easier to comb them out because they're not moving around. If I wanted to go completely insecticide, pediculicide free, I know that I could do it with olive oil. It would take some diligence. I did need to do it multiple days in a row, not only for the eggs to hatch and then to get those live lice, but to also just ensure that I was getting everything out. But I'm sure that I could clear it with olive oil alone. And then if I had Rid or Nix, or if that's what it was available to me, I certainly would still use those to debulk the lice. It's not great at eradicating the lice, so I would then adjunct with something else like olive oil or some of the things that we've mentioned.
Right. And then some people also wind up using tea tree oil shampoo, and that has been one of the classic treatments to prevent lice as well.
Oh, yes. Tea tree oil is another interesting all natural adjunct. It does have some mild pediculicide effect as well as some head lice repellent effect. So, for example, I used a tea tree oil hair detangler in my youngest daughter for a while when she was in early elementary school.
And head lice is one of these diagnoses that, from a medical standpoint, isn't something that pediatricians worry about.
Mhm.
Some other insect or parasitic diseases, we worry about them transmitting more or larger problems. Like, for
Exactly.
example, like tick bites causing Lyme's disease, or some mosquitoes transmitting malaria or encephalitis in some areas. So, those are from a medical standpoint, more quote unquote serious insect related medical problems. But as we've outlined in this episode, having lice go through your home and feeling like you have to do everything to eliminate every single louse in everyone's head, that can be an immensely stressful situation
Yes, yes.
for parents to deal with, even though there's not a really scary medical implication. So, I want to highlight that, oftentimes the pediatrician may make light of a lice diagnosis, but in reality, it can be extremely stressful.
Yes. And lastly, I'd like to say too, this is a bonding experience amongst parents. If you talk to any parent that has had head lice, you will immediately engage in conversation of the battle that you went through and how you emerged triumphant. And as you pointed out, Sylvia, I love that story about how your 9-year-old said he would shave his head. This was a
Yeah,
touching moment in parenting for you.
I remember that very vividly, and I'm still touched when I think about it because he did that for me, right?
So I hope that we can provide our listeners with some fortitude and finding joy even in this as they go forth in their parenting.
But as 10 kids, 2 docs, we fully understand the stress and the pressure of having lice go through your home. This is 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Sylvia Bank.
And I'm Vivian. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to 10 Kids, 2 Docs, hosted and created by Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and recommend our podcast to other listeners. Visit our website at 10kids2docs.com, where you can find links to social media and leave comments or suggestions. Back next week with more topics in parenting.